I will be presenting on intersectionality in civil rights issues. Specifically, I'm trying to look at ways that race intersects with other areas of civil rights, such as gender equality, LGBTQ rights, and disability rights. And then lastly, I'm going to try and bring it all together and talk about intersectionality activism and how I think fourth wave feminism and modern day feminists are at least attempting to shift the dialogue towards intersectionality and how we can use identity politics to better the civil rights movement. When talking about women's rights, it's easiest to understand in waves. There was the first, second, third, and now fourth wave feminism. Each one tends to have anchor issues, and in the first wave during the late 19th and early 20th century, the issues were largely centered around the most basic human rights. There were many different women involved in this movement, but many of these names are still well known today, and a lot are Black women. This is important because ultimately the movement failed Black women because white women believed that they were above the Black movement, and despite the hard work that Black women committed to the movement, they didn't feel that they actually deserved to be considered equal. Ida B. Wells was a journalist who published passionate works against lynching during a time when it was particularly prominent. She tried to work with the suffrage movement, but found that despite agreeing with the movement's leaderships on some issues, they were not interested in divisive pro-Black issues. Sojourner Truth is also widely known, particularly for her speech Anti-a-Woman, which is still used to this day to explore the way that Black women are excluded from conversations from womanhood, parenthood, personhood. Then in 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the Constitution's 19th Amendment to guarantee a woman's right to vote. However, it still wouldn't be until 1965 that President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, outlawing discriminatory practices which allowed women to finally be able to vote across the country. But Black women still gave blood, sweat, and tears to the movement, only to still not be really seen as the victors out of the movement. Second wave feminism was rooted in the idea that women had been pigeonholed into positions in the household and even in the workplace if they were able to work. The work of this generation of feminists resulted in the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Roe v. Wade. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 attempted to make it illegal to pay differently based on gender. This becomes increasingly important because as we move through the decades, we see that the gap between pay exists much more prominently for Black women and other women and men of color instead of just white women. Roe v. Wade would guarantee reproductive freedom for women and be considered a landmark case. However, they had a great concern about the use of birth control and sterilization and abortion, which was simultaneously being denied for white women who wanted to use it freely, their own choice, and being forced against Black women and other women of color. This became a huge sticking point for feminists at the time and resulted in a massive break leading to what was called the womanist movement, which was still about women's rights, but was centered around what Black women felt was being missed, which was the harm specifically against women of color. Third wave feminism is seen as a less than wave of feminism by many, mostly because once they dealt with the major issues of sexism in the early 90s, their focus was solely on creating a more united womanhood, and while there was a great deal of interest in theories of feminism, many felt that the battles that were fought by early feminists had already been won. This wave of feminism, though, would really begin grasping for what the meaning of intersectionality was in the movement. This is largely credited to Kimberly Crenshaw, who was among many to form this theory, but became the face of the idea as she publicly defended the notion many times since the 1980s. Essentially, the idea was that yes, being a woman may contribute to one aspect of oppression, but when a person exists with other characteristics such as being black, queer, disabled, these characteristics intersect and oftentimes change the oppression that a person experiences. It typically makes it worse. While these notions existed previously, it wasn't until third wave feminism that most of the basic legislation had been passed. And so there was time for this kind of theory and dialogue to happen, which was incredibly important to women's rights and also to acknowledging the work and historical presence of Black women in the movement. First and foremost, there is an idea that the Black community is more homophobic than the white community. It's important to dissect this for just a moment to understand that once again, this important topic intersects greatly with the power of race in a post-civil rights era American culture. We must acknowledge the way that both church and family units, as defined by a mother and father, became intrinsically tied to the way Black people are perceived and able to engage in civil liberties in the U.S. And so as a white person, I hesitate to speak on the topic in depth because I think that Black families are working so hard right now to support one another, but I have always heard it as a red herring, and so I just wanted to bring it up really quick and get that out of the way. So next we see LGBTQ activists who were also Black, which I think is incredibly important, again, for the reasons I just said. When we think of this in terms of intersectionality, we also know that Black women are already experiencing the world differently from their white feminist counterparts, and many LGBTQ activists also consider themselves feminists, so I tend to view these issues from a feminist lens myself. I did my speech presentation on Audre Lorde, who was an outspoken Black queer activist. She implored white women especially to consider the way that they contributed to an anti-Black system that harmed Black people. Additionally, one of the most famous contributors to the LGBTQ movement was a Black trans woman, Marsha P. Johnson. She is known for being a Black trans drag queen activist that was at the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall riots in 1969 were another incredibly important moment in civil rights, specifically for trans people of color. When it comes to Stonewall, it's important to note that LGBTQ activity was illegal in almost every state at the time, so gay clubs and bars were all operating illegally, and therefore typically relying on shady practices to keep in business, including threatening now wealthy gay patrons and the like, and raids were extremely common at this point. So Stonewall was a turning point because it was a time when people had finally had enough and chose to fight back. On June 24th, 1969, the Stonewall Club was raided and police arrested the employees and confiscated their alcohol. They immediately planned a second raid in hopes of shutting them down permanently on the 27th. However, it turns out that during the arrest they were making, people started fighting back. Many believe that Martha Johnson was one of the first to start throwing bottles. Now, she later said that that wasn't true. She came a little bit later onto the scene, but I think that really just speaks volumes to how well known she was, that people just assumed that she was there. But it is worth noting that many of the people who were there were Black and LGBTQ at the time, which is something that is missed historically. A lot of times when you see documentaries and you read magazines, even see pictures, we see a whitewashed version of what happened, even though many of the people who were there were Black. Now, ultimately, though, this event did lead to a gathering of LGBTQ people and would lead to the first Pride Parade in 1970, and is the reason that June is Pride Month, which is why I think it's pretty important. Another area where we often miss a huge intersection is that of disability and race. For the Black community post-civil rights era, there becomes a massive stigma around education access and ability. And by the mid-1900s, there is a huge program with forced commitments, experimentation, and sterilization on disabled people, specifically of people of color. So this, once again, sets an important background for the lens with which disability is viewed within the entire community historically. And according to a 2018 study, there is a few really important elements to take into consideration in respects to modern disability and intersectionality when we look at statistics. We are just beginning to shift the conversation away from disability being a negative health outcome and instead looking at it as a demographic characteristic. So this is incredibly important because when it comes to reporting outcomes, ultimately, it may lead to less stigma and may help with computing more accurate data, which up until recently has been very inaccurate because of what was stated previously to protect people with disabilities, specifically those who are also people of color. A disability can include many different things, which is why it has such a broad spectrum of physical and intellectual specificities while still being somewhat ubiquitous. Physical disabilities can be visible and invisible and require physical accommodations sometimes, which can be difficult to acquire if a child is significantly more likely to experience poverty and a low-performing school as a result, which happens for a lot of children of color. Couple this with results with problems with the intersections of intellectual disabilities and race. First, white males are more likely to be used as the subjects and archetypes for the testing used to identify disabilities. This results in misdiagnosis and even overdiagnoses and overrepresentation in minority races because race is not used to control for responses from children, parents, and their teachers. This can lead to more Black students being placed in low-performing class levels based on poor testing methodology, and can ultimately lead to other problems with behavior, grades, etc. First, it's important to note that I'm going to touch on a lot of opinion when I discuss fourth wave, because it's still an unclear and new concept and hasn't been fully established yet. I do believe that this movement is rooted in identity politics, though. I covered 4 areas: race, gender, sexuality, and disability. These are just 4 characteristics that change the way that a person experiences the world and that truly impact the way that the world treats them. This is a huge part of what makes this movement. Let's stop pretending there is nothing different about ourselves and instead acknowledge, embrace, accept, and allow differences as a means of a more cohesive existence. Me Too was an attempt to address rampant sexual assault and harassment, which statistically it's safe to say most women experience. Unfortunately, Tarana Burke was the creator of the idea and movement, but she was not properly credited by white feminists who co-opted her movement as their own, and this led to the alienation of Black women specifically, and really harmed the overall movement. The Women's March was meant to be an expression of taking back power in some way after the election of President Donald Trump. Unfortunately, it resulted in a huge portion of Black women and women of color feeling that not only were they not represented or included in the discussion properly, but that the overall movement was purposefully exclusionary. And since the election of Donald Trump, there has been time to remedy this situation, and there hasn't been much effort. And a lot of Black women have still felt alienated and unheard. I think that this next wave of activism really represents a better understanding of the compounding problems that exist in our world and our country. If a person is Black or has a disability or is LGBTQ or is a woman, they are more likely to experience poverty, struggle to find meaningful, gainful employment. Food and housing insecurity are a huge problem. Discrimination, incarceration are a problem as well. And if a person is incarcerated, they are more likely to have even more problems with all of the above. Imagine if a person identifies as more than one of those things. Maybe they're Black and they have a disability, or they have a disability and they're gay. They're a woman, they're Black, and they have a disability. Maybe they're all four. This is why I think that identity politics are not going away anytime soon, and I think that while it's popular to explore a world without them, we can't address the systemic problems without allowing people to embrace them and then use them as tools to dismantle the current system.